I pushed through the mahogany double doors of our Beacon Hill townhouse, every muscle in my body screaming from 16 hours straight in the surgical wing at Massachusetts General. My scrub still smelled like antiseptic and coffee. My hair was falling out of its bun in defeated strands, and all I wanted was to kiss my daughter goodnight and collapse into bed. The foyer was dark, except for the ambient lighting from the crystal chandelier, which seemed wrong for 8:30 on a Thursday night. Usually, Lily would be camped out in the living room with her homework spread across the Italian marble coffee table, waiting for me to come home so she could tell me about her day in that breathless way 7-year-olds do, like every single thing that happened was the most important event in human history. "Lily?" I called out, dropping my bag by the console table. The house felt too quiet, that particular kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. My mother appeared at the top of the stairs, still dressed in her typical evening wear, a silk blouse and tailored pants that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her face had that expression I'd learned to recognize over 33 years, the one that said she'd made a decision and expected everyone else to fall in line, like we were pieces on her personal chessboard. "Vivian," she said, my name clipped and cold in her mouth, "we need to talk." I was already moving past her, heading toward Lily's room, that maternal instinct kicking in like a fire alarm. "Where's Lily? Is she okay?" My mother's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman who'd never done a day of manual labor in her life. "She's fine. She's with your sister. But we need to discuss something first." I yanked my arm away and kept walking, my heart starting to hammer in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Lily's door was open, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The room was half empty. Her white bookshelf with all the medical encyclopedias I'd been collecting for her since she was 3, the ones she'd loved because she wanted to be a surgeon like Mommy, was completely bare. Her desk was gone. The reading nook I'd had custom built into the bay window where we'd spent countless hours reading together had been stripped of its cushions and throw pillows. Even her bulletin board, covered in drawings and photos and little notes we'd written to each other, had been taken down, leaving nothing but nail holes in the pale pink wall. My sister Charlotte was standing in the middle of the room, directing 2 men I didn't recognize as they carried out Lily's dresser, the antique one I'd found at an estate sale in Connecticut and had restored myself during my residency, working on it at 3 in the morning when I couldn't sleep because I was too worried about making a mistake that could cost someone their life. "What the hell is going on?" My voice came out steady, which surprised me because inside I was fragmenting into 1,000 pieces. Charlotte turned to me with this smile, this satisfied little smirk that I'd seen a million times growing up, usually right after she'd gotten me in trouble for something or taken credit for my work or convinced our parents that her version of events was the truth. "Oh, good, you're home. We were just finishing up." She gestured around the decimated room like she was a real estate agent showing off a property. "I'm thinking soft gray for the walls, maybe some minimalist furniture. This room has such good light, it's wasted on a kid's bedroom." I stepped forward and grabbed her wrist, probably harder than I should have, but I was running on fumes and fury and something that felt like my entire world tilting on its axis. "Where is my daughter?" That's when something crystallized in my mind, cold and clear and sharp as a scalpel. I understood exactly what was happening, could see the whole picture like I was looking at an X-ray. This wasn't about Lily's well-being. This was about control, about punishment, about my mother finally finding a way to make me pay for every choice I'd made that didn't align with her vision for my life. For going to medical school instead of marrying the investment banker she'd picked out, for having Lily without a husband, choosing to use a sperm donor instead of waiting for the right man to come along, for refusing to join the family real estate business and insisting on making my own way, for being too busy saving lives to play my role in the perfect upper-class Boston family portrait she wanted to project to the world. I looked at my mother, then at my sister, and I felt this strange calm settle over me. It was the same feeling I got in the OR when a surgery wasn't going according to plan, when I had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. You can't panic. You can't let emotion cloud your judgment. You assess the situation, you identify your options, and you execute with precision. "I see," I said quietly. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, like she'd expected tears or yelling or begging. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Lily will have a much more stable environment in Newport. Charlotte and I will make sure she gets the kind of upbringing a Harrington girl deserves. You can visit on weekends when your schedule allows. I nodded slowly, like I was considering this. And whose idea was this, exactly? Yours, Mother? Or did Charlotte suggest it? Charlotte jumped in before our mother could answer, her voice eager. Actually, Marcus and I have been discussing it for a while. We think it's what's best for Lily, and Mother agreed. Marcus, Charlotte's husband, the hedge fund manager who'd made a fortune betting against the housing market in 2008 and had been riding that wave of success ever since, acting like he was some kind of financial genius instead of just a guy who'd gotten lucky being ruthless at the right time. I walked over to the window, looking out at the gas lamps lining the brick sidewalk, the perfectly maintained historic buildings that had witnessed centuries of Boston's elite playing their power games. Here's the thing, I said, my voice still unnaturally calm. You can't vote on my daughter. She's not a corporate merger or a trust fund distribution. She's a human being, and she's my child, and what you've done is called kidnapping. My mother actually laughed. Don't be absurd. We're family. You can't kidnap your own granddaughter. I turned back to face them, and I let them see exactly what I was feeling for just a second before I locked it down again. Watch me prove you wrong. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, keeping my eyes locked on my mother's face as I did it. Her expression shifted from amused condescension to shock to something that might have been fear. Hello? Yes, I need to report a kidnapping. My 7-year-old daughter has been taken from my home without my consent by my mother and sister. Yes, I'm the custodial parent. Yes, I know where they've taken her. No, I don't want to wait and work it out as a family matter. I want to file a formal police report. Charlotte's face went white. You're calling the cops on your own mother? Are you insane? I held up one finger, signaling her to be quiet while I gave the dispatcher our address and the information about Lily. When I hung up, I looked at both of them and said, I'm a surgeon at one of the best hospitals in the country. I make life and death decisions every single day. I've had people's hearts literally in my hands. Did you really think you could manipulate me like I'm some helpless little girl who needs her mommy to make decisions for her? I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions she usually kept locked down tight. Fury, disbelief, and finally, a cold calculation. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Bring her back, she said tersely. Now. She hung up and looked at me with pure hatred. You've just made a very big mistake, Vivian. I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. No, Mother, you made the mistake. You thought you could use my daughter as a pawn in whatever sick game you and Charlotte have been playing. But here's what you forgot. I might have your last name, but I'm nothing like you. I actually love my child more than I love control. The officers stayed until my father's driver pulled up 45 minutes later with Lily. She came running into the house, her little face streaked with tears, and threw herself into my arms. Mommy, Grandma said we were going on a surprise vacation, but I told her I couldn't go without telling you, and she said you already knew, but I didn't believe her, and I wanted to come home, but she wouldn't let me call you. I held her tight, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo, feeling her solid warmth against me. It's okay, baby. You're home now. You're safe. Over Lily's head, I looked at my mother and Charlotte. The officers were taking their statements, but I knew nothing would really come of it. The Harringtons had too much money, too many connections, and too much practice at making problems disappear. But that was okay. I had other plans. After everyone left and I got Lily settled in bed, promising her that no one would take her anywhere without my permission ever again, I sat down at my laptop and started making a list. Because I hadn't just been working my ass off at Mass General for the past 7 years for the salary. I'd been building relationships, cultivating connections with people who had real power, not just old money and social standing. People like the district attorney, whose son I'd operated on 2 years ago, removing a brain tumor that every other surgeon had said was inoperable. Like the investigative journalist at the Globe, who I'd helped expose a medical fraud case. Like the state senator whose mother I'd saved from a stroke during a particularly complicated surgery. I'd also been doing something else, something I'd started doing about 3 years ago when I realized my family was never going to change, never going to accept that I was my own person with my own life. I'd been documenting everything. Every passive-aggressive comment, every attempt at manipulation, every time they'd tried to undermine me as a mother, every instance of them using money as a weapon. I had emails, texts, recorded phone conversations. Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state, but I'd always informed them I was recording, buried in the beginning of conversations. Just so you know, I'm recording this for my records, which they always breezed past. I had a whole file of documentation about their business practices, too. Because when you grow up in a family like mine, you learn things. You overhear conversations at dinner parties. You see documents left out in your father's study. You understand how the money really gets made. And it's not always legal, and it's definitely not always ethical. I knew about the shell companies they used to hide assets, the tax avoidance schemes that crossed the line into evasion, the bribes paid to city officials to get zoning variances, the tenants who'd been illegally evicted from rent-controlled apartments so those buildings could be converted to luxury condos. I'd been sitting on this information for years, telling myself I was keeping it as insurance, as a nuclear option I'd never have to use. Tonight, they'd given me a reason to use it. I started with an email to my father's accountant, the one who'd always seemed like he had a conscience, who'd looked uncomfortable at family gatherings when the conversation turned to their latest scheme. I attached some of the documents I'd copied years ago and asked some pointed questions about certain transactions that I knew weren't quite above board. I CC'd it to the IRS whistleblower email address. Then I sent a carefully worded package to the journalist at the Globe with enough information to start asking questions, but not enough to be accused of libel. I included the story about how they'd tried to take Lily, framing it as part of a larger pattern of wealthy families believing they were above the law. Finally, I called my lawyer, the one who'd helped me set up my own trust fund when I'd gotten my first big bonus from the hospital, keeping it separate from anything my family could touch. I told him everything that had happened and asked him to draw up a restraining order against my mother and Charlotte, barring them from coming within 500 feet of Lily or our home without my express permission. "Are you sure you want to do this, Vivian?" He studied me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant he realized I wasn't bluffing. "You'd destroy your own family?" "In a heartbeat," I said. "If it meant protecting my daughter, because that's what actual love looks like, Dad. Not control disguised as concern, not manipulation dressed up as tradition. Real love means putting someone else's well-being above your own ego." I stood up to leave, but he stopped me. "Wait, I need to know. Is this about more than just last night? Because your mother said you've been pulling away for years, and she thought that by taking Lily, she could force me back into line," I finished for him. "That she could make me dependent on her again, make me grateful for her help raising my daughter. That's how she thinks, Dad. Everything is about control. But I don't need her help. I don't need her money. I don't need her approval. I'm a damn good surgeon, I'm a damn good mother, and I've built a life that has nothing to do with being a Harrington." Something flickered across his face, something that might have been regret or sadness or just exhaustion from decades of being married to my mother. "She means well," he said, but it sounded hollow even to him. "No," I said. "She means to win. There's a difference." I walked out of his office and took the elevator down to the ground floor, stepping out into a perfect September morning in Boston, the kind of day where the air is crisp and clean and full of possibility. My phone buzzed with a text from the hospital asking if I'd be in tomorrow, and I realized that after tonight, after making my threats and drawing my lines in the sand, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying around a weight I didn't even know was there until I set it down. The next few weeks were interesting, to say the least. The restraining order went through with surprising ease, probably because my mother's lawyer took one look at the documented evidence of what had happened and advised her not to fight it. The IRS sent my father's accountant a very friendly letter requesting some additional information about certain transactions. The Globe ran a story about wealthy families in Boston using their connections to evade taxes and exploit rent-controlled housing, and while they didn't name the Harringtons directly, anyone who knew anything about Boston real estate could read between the lines. Charlotte called me 17 times in one day, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails about how I'd ruined everything, how I was a vindictive bitch, how she'd make sure I never got another moment of peace. I saved every single one of them and forwarded them to my lawyer. My mother tried a different approach. She started a whisper campaign among Boston society, suggesting that I was unstable, that I was an unfit mother who was too focused on my career to properly care for Lily, that I was having some kind of breakdown. But here's the thing about being a successful surgeon in a city like Boston: people tend to believe in your competence and stability, especially when those people include other doctors, hospital administrators, patients whose lives you've saved, and families who trust you with their most precious relationships. The Whisper campaign went nowhere. In fact, it backfired spectacularly when one of my mother's country club friends, a woman whose husband I'd operated on the previous year, called her out publicly at some charity gala, asking her why she was spreading lies about her own daughter instead of being proud of having raised such an accomplished woman. I heard about it third hand from another surgeon whose wife had been there, and apparently my mother had turned so red she'd look like she might have a stroke herself. But the real turning point came about 6 weeks after the incident, when I got a call from my father asking if he could take me to lunch. Just him, no mother, no Charlotte, no agenda except to talk. I agreed, mostly because I was curious. We met at a quiet restaurant in Cambridge, the kind of place where Harvard professors meet their sources and have conversations that need to stay private. He ordered scotch, even though it was noon, which told me how serious this was. "Your mother wants to sue you for grandparents' rights," he said without preamble. I'd expected this, honestly. It was the next logical move in her playbook. She can try. Massachusetts law is pretty clear that grandparents only have standing if the child's parents are divorced or deceased, or if there's already an established relationship that's in the best interest of the child. Since I'm the only legal parent and I've been the primary caregiver since birth, and since your wife literally tried to kidnap my daughter, I'm pretty sure no judge is going to side with her. He took a long drink of his scotch. I told her the same thing. She's talking to lawyers anyway. Of course she is, because this isn't about Lily. It's about the fact that I won. I drew a line, I enforced consequences, and I won. And Mother can't stand that. My father looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "When did you get so hard?" I'm not hard. I'm a mother protecting her child. There's a difference. If you can't see that, if you still think that what Mother did was somehow acceptable or understandable or forgivable, then you're part of the problem. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his glass. Charlotte's marriage is... The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture that was somehow even more twisted than I'd imagined. So, Mother tried to steal my daughter to use as marriage counseling for Charlotte? To give her a practice child to play house with while her husband screws his secretary? My father flinched. "Your mother thought it would help. She thought Lily would be better off in a two-parent household, even if it wasn't yours." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. A two-parent household where one parent is cheating and the other is so desperate to save face that she'd steal her niece? Yeah, that sounds like a great environment for a 7-year-old. Jesus Christ, Dad, do you even hear yourself? "I know how it sounds," he said quietly, "but your mother grew up in a different time, with different values. She thinks marriage and family structure matter more than anything else. More than honesty? More than consent? More than my daughter's actual well-being?" I shook my head. "Those aren't values, Dad. That's just control wearing a fancy hat." I stood up to leave, but he grabbed my hand. His grip was weak, trembling slightly, and I realized with a shock that he was crying. I'd never seen my father cry, not once in my entire life. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have stopped her. I should have said no. I should have protected you from her a long time ago, but I was weak, and I chose the easy path, and I'm sorry." I looked down at him, this man who'd always seemed so powerful, so in control, and saw him for what he really was, someone who'd spent so long enabling my mother's behavior that he'd forgotten how to stand up to her, someone who'd chosen peace over principles so many times that he'd lost sight of the difference. "I accept your apology," I said, "but it doesn't change anything. You can have a relationship with Lily and me if you want, but it has to be on my terms. You come alone. You respect my boundaries. You never, ever enable Mother's behavior again, and if you can't do that, then I'm sorry, but you're choosing her over your granddaughter." He nodded, tears still running down his face, and I left him there in that restaurant with his scotch and his regrets. The grandparents' rights lawsuit never materialized. I don't know if my father talked Mother out of it or if her lawyers just told her she didn't have a case. But 3 months after the incident, I got a formal letter from her attorney stating that she was withdrawing any claims to visitation with Lily. The letter also included a check for $100,000 made out to a trust in Lily's name with a note that said it was for her education and future. I didn't cash it. I sent it back with a note of my own. Lily's future is not for sale. Charlotte's divorce went through 6 months later. It was messy and public, with Marcus's affair being detailed in court documents that somehow made their way to the society pages. Charlotte lost the house in Chestnut Hill, most of their joint assets, and, from what I heard, her mind for a little while. She checked herself into some wellness retreat in California and stayed there for 3 months. I felt something when I heard that, but it wasn't satisfaction. It was just sad. Sad that we'd grown up in the same house with the same parents, and somehow I'd learned to break the cycle while she'd just perpetuated it. Sad that she'd burned up her life chasing after the same kind of marriage and status that our mother valued, instead of figuring out what she actually wanted. Sad that we'd probably never have a real relationship because she couldn't see past her own hurt to understand why I'd done what I'd done. My father started coming to Sunday dinners at my place, just him and Lily and me. He'd sit at my kitchen table and help Lily with her homework or read to her, and slowly, carefully, we built something new. It wasn't the relationship we'd had before, but it was more honest, more real. He never talked about my mother unless I asked, and I rarely asked. I heard through the grapevine that she was still furious, still telling anyone who would listen that I was ungrateful and cruel and had destroyed the family. I heard that she'd started drinking more, that she'd resigned from some of her board positions, that she'd become increasingly isolated as people realized that her version of events didn't quite match up with reality. I felt sorry for her sometimes, in the same distant way you feel sorry for a stranger whose life has taken a wrong turn. But I didn't regret what I'd done, not for a second, because every night I went home to Lily. Every night I got to tuck her in and read her a story and kiss her forehead and know that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was growing up in a house where her worth wasn't measured by her obedience or her usefulness or her ability to enhance someone else's image. Every night I got to be her mother, not because some family vote decided I was worthy of the role, but because I'd fought for it, because I'd been willing to burn down everything my family had built rather than let my daughter be a pawn in their games. 1 year after the incident, on a Tuesday night after a particularly long surgery, I came home to find Lily sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her. She looked up at me with those big, dark eyes that were so much like mine and said, "Mommy, Madison at school said that her grandma takes her to ice cream every week and spoils her and stuff. How come I don't see grandma anymore?" I sat down next to her and thought about how to explain it in a way that an 8-year-old could understand without poisoning her against my mother entirely. "Sometimes," I said carefully. Grown-ups make choices that hurt other people, even when they think they're doing the right thing. Grandma made some choices that weren't good for you or for me, and until she can understand why those choices were wrong, it's better if we keep some distance. She thought about this, her face scrunched up in concentration. Did she say sorry? She hugged me back, and I felt that same fierce protectiveness that I'd felt the night I'd walked into her half-empty room. That bone-deep certainty that I would do anything, sacrifice anything, destroy anything to keep her safe and whole and free to become whoever she wanted to be. I love you, baby, I said, forever and ever, no matter what. I love you too, Mommy, she said, and then she pulled back and grinned. Even when you come home smelling like hospital and you're too tired to make a good dinner. I laughed, really laughed, and it felt good. How about I order us pizza and we watch a movie? I think I can stay awake that long. We ended up falling asleep on the couch together halfway through Moana, Lily curled up against my side, her breathing deep and even. I woke up around midnight and carried her to bed, tucking her in under the butterfly quilt she'd picked out herself at a store in Harvard Square. Standing there in the doorway of her room, watching her sleep in the soft glow of her nightlight, I thought about that moment 6 months ago when I'd walked in to find everything stripped away. I thought about how my mother had expected me to break, to beg, to fall in line like I always had before. She'd miscalculated. She'd forgotten that I spent my days cutting into people's brains, making decisions where the margin between life and death was measured in millimeters. She'd forgotten that I'd chosen to become a neurosurgeon specifically because it was the hardest, most demanding specialty, because I wanted to prove to myself that I was capable of anything. She'd forgotten that every single day, I held people's lives in my hands and trusted my own judgment to do the right thing. And most importantly, she'd forgotten that being a mother changes you in ways that nothing else can. It gives you a strength you didn't know you had, a willingness to be ruthless that you never thought you'd possess. It makes you realize that some things are worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth burning down the whole world for if that's what it takes. My mother had thought she was taking my daughter for Lily's own good, for the good of the family, for the preservation of whatever twisted legacy she thought the Harrington name represented. But what she'd really done was show me exactly who she was and what she was capable of. And in doing so, she'd freed me from the guilt I'd always carried about not being the daughter she wanted, freed me from the obligation to maintain a relationship that was built on manipulation and control, freed me to build the kind of family I actually wanted, one based on respect and honesty and genuine love. I closed Lily's door softly and walked back to my own room, where my phone was buzzing with a message from the hospital. Emergency surgery needed in 2 hours, a complicated aneurysm case that the attending wanted my input on. I texted back that I'd be there and started getting ready, running through the procedure in my mind, thinking about approaches and contingencies, and all the tiny details that could make the difference between success and tragedy. This was my life now. Surgery and Lily and the chosen family I was building with people who actually valued me for who I was, not what I could do for them or how well I could play a role in their grand design. It was exhausting and demanding and sometimes lonely, but it was mine. I'd fought for it and I'd won. And if my mother ever tried to take it from me again, I'd be ready. Because I knew now what I was capable of. I knew how far I was willing to go. And I knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever use my daughter as a weapon against me again. Not my mother, not my sister, not anyone. As I drove through the empty Boston streets toward the hospital, the city lights reflecting off the Charles River, I thought about that moment when I'd called 911, when I'd looked at my mother and sister and said the words that had changed everything, when I'd chosen to fight